The chalk snapped like a bone breaking, sharp, sudden, and final. Miss Hope didn't flinch. She simply reached for another piece, her manicured nails clicking against the wooden tray, as if even the chalk's failure irritated her. "Pay attention," she said without turning. "Some of you need every crumb of education you can get." In the back of the room, she sat, elbows on the battered desk, hood half up, eyes locked on the blackboard like a hunter tracking prey. Her name was Amara Lewis, and no one said it right the first time. Teachers forgot it, mispronounced it, shortened it, but they would remember it soon. Jefferson High didn't look like a school. It felt like a waiting room for failure. Chipped tiles, rusted lockers, metal detectors at the entrance. The walls smelled like bleach and old despair. And inside those walls, the message was clear. If you're poor, if you're black, if you don't speak like them, you don't belong here. Amara knew it. She'd known it since her first day, when a security guard followed her to class just because she walked too fast, when teachers called on everyone but her, when they talked about achievement gaps like she was the living embodiment of statistics. But Amara had a secret. Behind her quiet eyes burned something sharp and dangerous. Genius. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that grows like weeds through concrete. She didn't speak much, didn't raise her hand. She listened, studied, waited. They thought silence meant ignorance. They thought worn sneakers and Southside slang meant she had nothing to offer. But the cracks in the system were showing, and Amara had learned how to slip through them, unnoticed, gathering knowledge like a storm gathers heat. And soon, it would all come to a head. In this classroom, under the dead glow of flickering lights, with a white teacher and her broken chalk. She just didn't know it yet. Some revolutions don't start with gunfire. They start with a question at the blackboard, and the wrong student being called to answer it. Mrs. Hope smiled too often, that tight, porcelain kind of smile that never touched her eyes. To the principal, to the parents at PTA meetings, she was a model of professional warmth, always dressed in muted earth tones, hair in a neat bun, voice syrupy sweet. She wore her kindness like a perfectly pressed blouse, ironed, intentional, calculated. But in her classroom, she ruled like a queen in exile, bitter that the kingdom she got wasn't the one she deserved. She had once dreamed of private academies, debate teams, Ivy League legacies. Instead, she got Jefferson High and students like Amara Lewis. "This place," she would mutter when she thought no one was listening, "is a daycare for degenerates." She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her racism was refined. Not the loud, crude kind, but the quiet poison that seeps under skin. She didn't say black. She said urban. She didn't say poor. She said underprivileged. And when Amara walked into her classroom every morning, she didn't see a girl. She saw a problem waiting to happen. Mrs. Hope believed in structure, in rules, in clear hierarchies. She also believed certain people belonged at the bottom of them. She never outright said that students like Amara wouldn't go far. She did worse. She showed it, every single day. She never called on her, even when Amara's hand was the only one up. She marked her work with red pen and phrases like, "Too ambitious for your level." She offered praise to students who barely tried, as long as their skin was pale and their English was polished. And the class noticed. The white kids smirked. Some copied her tone, her dismissive glances. A few joked behind Amara's back, testing the limits. No one stopped them. Why would they? The teacher's silence was permission. Amara never cried. Not once. But every day, she felt it, that invisible boot pressing on her spine. Not enough to break her, but enough to remind her, "You're not welcome here." What Mrs. Hope didn't know was this. While she tried to clip Amara's wings, she was only making them sharper. In the quiet, Amara studied her, the teacher who smiled with teeth, but never with soul. She watched the cracks in that perfect white mask grow, and waited, because revolutions are not always loud. Sometimes they come from the most silent student in the room, and sometimes the mask doesn't break. It shatters. Soon. Let's take a brief pause. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this? Or known someone who has? Your story matters. And if this narrative speaks to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. We continue. There was a silence in the room that didn't feel quiet. It felt loaded. The kind of silence that presses against your skin, waiting to explode. The rain tapped lightly against the windows, like a clock counting down. Then came the voice. "Miss Lewis," Mrs. Hope said, stretching the syllables like they tasted sour in her mouth. "To the board, please." Amara didn't move right away, not out of fear, but calculation. She knew this wasn't about learning. It never was. This was performance, and she'd been cast as the fool. She stood slowly. Every eye followed her. Some amused, some blank. A few, the ones who knew, held a flicker of worry. Mrs. Hope gestured to a dense algebra problem already written across the board. Equations stacked like a trap. It wasn't today's lesson. It wasn't even on the syllabus. "Let's see," Mrs. Hope said, pacing with a theatrical sigh. "You always seem so eager to show how smart you are, Miss Lewis. Prove it. Solve this." She turned to the class, smirking. "Let's see what genius looks like when it's not copied from Google." A few chuckles broke out. The white kids laughed louder than the rest. Someone in the back whispered, "She's gonna choke." Another, "She can't even spell her name right." Mrs. Hope didn't stop them. She heard them. She just folded her arms and watched. Amara stared at the board. Her hand gripped the marker. She could solve it, easily. But this wasn't about math. It was about power. If she solved it, she'd be accused of cheating again. If she failed, she'd be humiliated. That was the trap. Mrs. Hope leaned in, her voice low enough for only Amara to hear. "You don't belong here. They'll never say it out loud, but I'm saying it for them." Amara didn't look at her, didn't blink. She began to write. Not quickly, not dramatically, just clear, clean, efficient. Symbols flowed from her marker like a language only she spoke. The class got quieter. The snickering died down. Even Mrs. Hope stopped moving. When Amara finished, she stepped back, capped the marker, and returned to her seat without a word. Mrs. Hope stared at the board, silent. The answer was correct. Every line, every step. And for a split second, the mask cracked. Just a hairline fracture. But Amara saw it. She felt it, like the first vibration before an earthquake. Mrs. Hope turned back to the class, her voice suddenly cold. "We'll go over the correct method later. Moving on." She couldn't say it, couldn't admit it, because if Amara was right, it meant she was wrong, and the system never admits it's wrong. Amara sat back, eyes forward, face calm, but in her chest, her heart beat steady and defiant. She had won, quietly, publicly, brilliantly, and everyone had seen it. Amara sat still, her back straight, hands resting calmly on her desk. The silence of the room was almost deafening. It wasn't the peaceful silence of concentration, nor the casual quiet between conversations. No, this was the kind of silence that filled the air with the weight of something unsaid, something building. The kind of silence that clung to your skin, forcing you to breathe differently, to act differently. It was the calm before the storm. The final bell would ring soon, signaling the end of the school day. Students would shuffle out, the clamour of their voices and footsteps filling the halls, but Amara remained in her seat. She could feel the eyes of her classmates lingering on her. Whispers were building, buzzing beneath the surface, like insects skittering just out of reach. Their presence felt, but not fully seen. The tension was thick, heavier than the classroom air itself. In her mind, though, there was nothing but stillness. She had never spoken out, never raised her voice in defiance. She had learned long ago that in places like Jefferson High, silence was safer. But silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. And right now, Amara was preparing. She was absorbing every insult, every glance, every condescending word spoken in the halls, every sneer on the faces of the teachers and students. All of it was being stored away, like fuel in the pit of her stomach, coiling tighter and tighter with every passing second. She wasn't sure if Mrs. Hope knew what she had done. The humiliating game of the day, forcing Amara to solve a problem that wasn't even part of the lesson, putting her on display like some kind of circus animal, had been a moment of calculation, not mistake. Mrs. Hope wanted to break her. She wanted to reduce her to nothing, to show everyone that someone like Amara, someone from the wrong side of town, someone black, couldn't possibly belong in the world of academia. The idea that someone like Amara could outsmart her, outclass her, made the teacher's blood boil in a way that had nothing to do with learning and everything to do with pride. Amara knew all of this. She had learned to read people like Mrs. Hope long ago. The teacher's kind words, her attempts at smiling, her understanding gestures, all of it was a mask that concealed the ugly truth, that to people like Mrs. Hope, people like Amara were always going to be less than. They were to be tolerated, perhaps, but never truly accepted. Amara wasn't angry. No, anger was too easy, too obvious. Instead, there was something much deeper, much darker, building inside her. It wasn't hatred, exactly, though it came close. It was the quiet fury that comes with being constantly underestimated, constantly belittled. The fury that simmers beneath the surface until one day, when the moment arrives, it will erupt, and everyone will see what they've been ignoring all along. Her hands were trembling, but she made no move to stop them. She let the feeling pass through her, feeling the tension in her fingers, the tightness in her chest. It was the only release she allowed herself in this classroom of restraints. She let her emotions simmer just below the surface, her mind already calculating, already planning. She could feel the eyes on her now. The whispers that had been floating just under the surface earlier were louder now, more insistent. Her classmates knew that something had changed. They had watched her solve the problem, watched Mrs. Hope try to bury her in public humiliation, and they had seen that Amara had stood there, calm and poised, while their teacher floundered. They didn't know what to make of it, but they knew something was different. And in this school, in this environment, different was a dangerous thing. The bell rang, loud and sharp. Students began to gather their things, pushing back their chairs, standing up and shuffling toward the door, eager to escape the claustrophobic atmosphere of the classroom. But Amara remained in her seat, watching them all file out, her gaze never wavering. One by one, they all passed her. They glanced at her, their eyes flicking toward her face before quickly darting away, as if afraid to make contact. A few of them gave her nods of acknowledgement, awkward and unsure. They had seen what she could do, and now they were afraid of it. Amara stood up only once the room had emptied. She didn't rush. She moved slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of every step, every movement, as if the classroom itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The teacher's desk was still piled with papers, unfinished lessons, her half-drunk cup of coffee forgotten. Mrs. Hope had long since left, retreating into whatever space she retreated to when she was defeated, a place where she could pretend that everything was still under control. Amara didn't need to see Mrs. Hope's face to know what was going through her mind. She could hear the teacher's words in her head. She could hear the mockery, the disbelief in her voice. You'll never be more than this. You'll always be the exception, but not the rule. Amara could hear those words like they had been etched into her brain. She had heard them before in different places, different faces. They were always the same, always the same. But Amara had made her choice. She wasn't going to scream. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to shout her anger to the heavens. She wasn't going to let anyone see how deeply they had cut her. No, the real power, the real victory, lay in doing nothing at all, in allowing the silence to hang in the air like a heavy storm cloud. And so, she let the anger, the frustration, the bitterness, all settle into her bones. She let them soak in like rain, deep into the core of her being. Because Amara knew one thing: storms don't last forever. What Mrs. Hope didn't realize was that the storm had already begun, and now it was just a matter of time before it would hit. The classroom was still. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, deliberate intervals. Outside, the world moved. Students ran across the yard, their laughter echoing through the halls, as if everything was just fine. But in this room, in this moment, nothing was fine. Amara sat at her desk, the paper before her blank for just a moment too long. The test was the same as always, problems pulled from the curriculum, the same equations that had been drilled into their minds day after day. This was supposed to be a moment for her to blend in, to hide her talents just enough to escape the teacher's scrutiny. A moment to conform. But as she read the first question, one of the last on the page, something inside her clicked. She had solved equations like these before, but this one was different. It wasn't the equation itself that intrigued her. It was the way it was written, the way it felt. A trap designed to be unsolvable. A challenge with no clear way forward. Mrs. Hope had designed this question like the others. An obstacle that would leave most students fumbling. But Amara wasn't like the others. She read the question again. The other students around her were scribbling answers, checking their work, tapping their pens against the desk, each one moving along a well-worn path of mediocrity. But Amara wasn't interested in mediocrity. She wasn't interested in blending in. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against the pages of her notes, the old scraps of paper, calculations from a week ago, diagrams from her private studies. Amara had studied the material in a different way, the way she always did, searching for deeper patterns, for the beauty beneath the surface. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, she saw the solution. Not in the form the teacher had expected, but in a new way. A way no one had ever thought to apply. The clock continued ticking. She started to write. No one noticed at first. The other students were too focused on their own tests, too absorbed in their limited perspective of what was possible. They didn't notice the way her pen moved. Fast, sure, with a clarity they didn't have. The calculations spilled across the page like water from a broken dam, the formula taking shape in a way that felt almost effortless. Amara wasn't just solving the problem. She was rewriting it. She was bending the rules. By the time the last student finished their test, Amara had completed it all. She didn't look around. She didn't need to. She knew what she had done was far beyond what anyone expected. And then, the moment came. Mrs. Hope walked up and down the aisles, her heels clicking against the floor. The usual cold gaze scanned the papers, checking for the same mistakes, the same missteps she had seen 1,000 times before. When she reached Amara's desk, she paused. The silence between them stretched longer than it should have. The air in the room thickened, as if the entire world had stopped to wait for the inevitable. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She only looked at the teacher, her face calm, unreadable. Mrs. Hope picked up the test. Her eyes scanned the pages, moving faster and faster, the lines on her face growing tighter. Her lips pressed into a thin line. There was a flicker of something. Anger, maybe. Disbelief. Her fingers twitched as they skimmed over the equations Amara had written. But her expression never wavered. It was impossible. She dropped the test on Amara's desk with a small thud. Her voice, when it came, was sharp, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Where did you get this?" she hissed, her words low but furious. "This is not what we've been taught. This is not the right way to solve this problem." The class had gone silent. The whispers from before had ceased. Everyone had turned their attention to Amara. The teacher's voice had the power of authority, the ability to silence all doubts, all questions. But Amara's answer, it didn't fit. It was a break from the mold, and that was the problem. The truth hit harder than any insult ever could. Mrs. Hope was furious. She had expected to see failure, to see Amara's shortcomings laid bare before the class. But instead, there was brilliance. Her brilliance, an intelligence that hadn't been taught, that hadn't been molded by her. "You're cheating, aren't you?" Mrs. Hope continued, her voice rising now. "You must be. You can't have done this on your own. No one from your kind, your background, is capable of this." The words hung in the air. Your kind. Your background. It wasn't just about the test anymore. It wasn't about the equation. It was about everything that was said in that moment. It was the accusation that people like Amara didn't belong in a world like this. That they couldn't possibly belong in a space reserved for those who had been properly trained. Those who knew the right way to think, to act, to solve problems. The words were a blow, harder than anything Amara had endured. But there was no hesitation. There was no break in her composure. She had heard it all before, the undertones of racism, the assumptions, the thinly veiled prejudices that always lurked just beneath the surface. Mrs. Hope's fury was nothing new. It was the same thing, over and over. "I didn't cheat," Amara said, her voice quiet, steady. "I just solved the problem, the way it should have been solved." The class remained still. They waited, all of them, for something to break, for Amara to crack, for her to apologize, for her to fall in line. They didn't want her to win. They didn't want her to defy the narrative they had written for her. But Amara didn't need their approval. Mrs. Hope's face flushed red, the lines of her face deepening as the words burned in her throat. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to this challenge. All she knew was that Amara was not supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to be this good. She wasn't supposed to have done something the right way, when she wasn't even supposed to have been given the chance. There was no answer. There could be no answer. "Bring this to the principal's office," Mrs. Hope spat, her voice seething with venom. "We'll see what they think about your brilliant method." Amara stood up slowly, gathering her things. Her movements were measured, deliberate, as if she were in no rush. She knew exactly what was coming. She had seen this moment before. She had seen people like her dragged to the principal's office, labeled as troublemakers, as anomalies. It didn't scare her anymore. "Fine," Amara replied calmly. "Let's go." As she walked toward the door, the rest of the class stayed frozen in place, watching her, some with confusion, others with fear. The whispers would follow her, as they always did. But this time, they weren't about her failure. They weren't about her mistakes. They were about her brilliance. The brilliance that had slipped through their fingers. The brilliance that had shattered the glass wall they had tried to build around her. Amara didn't look back. She didn't need to. They were all going to learn her name, whether they liked it or not. And when the storm finally broke, it would leave them all in its wake. The principal's office was cold. The air smelled of polished wood and stale judgment, the kind of judgment that lingered in the corners of the room, hanging over the chair where Amara sat, alone. The door was shut, the buzz of the outside world muffled by the thick walls of this small, sterile space. The heavy weight of silence pressed in on her, but she didn't move. She had been here before, not in this room perhaps, but in other rooms like it. The rooms of the powerful, where people who weren't supposed to belong were always made to feel like intruders. This wasn't new. This wasn't the first time they had tried to make her small. The principal's office, the place where problems went to die, where the marginalized were stripped of their dignity and sent away with a quiet nod, their future compromised. She had walked into this office many times before, but today felt different. Today, it wasn't her fault. It wasn't her wrongdoings they were gathering to punish. No, today was different. Amara sat in the chair, her back straight, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She had been called in under the pretense of clarifying the situation, but she knew what this was really about. Mrs. Hope had wasted no time. The accusations were already flying. Accusations of cheating, accusations of undermining the system. Mrs. Hope had told the principal that Amara had somehow managed to outsmart the test, that her answer didn't come from the methods taught in class. But that wasn't what had happened. Amara had just solved the problem. And that, it seemed, was the biggest offense of all. Her mind ran through the events again, over and over. She thought of how Mrs. Hope had raised her voice, how the teacher's anger had escalated in front of the class, accusing her of cheating without a shred of evidence. There had been no opportunity for her to explain, no time to articulate the brilliance behind her solution. The moment the solution had been placed on her desk, Mrs. Hope had made up her mind. This girl doesn't belong here. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of the door opening. Mrs. Hope entered, her heels clicking against the floor with every step. She stood rigid, her face a mask of forced professionalism. But Amara could see it, the disdain, the venom just below the surface, bubbling up as the teacher's eyes found hers. "Amara Lewis," Mrs. Hope said, her voice cold. "You've been accused of cheating." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. The principal, a balding man with thick glasses, looked up from his desk. His eyes flicked over her, but there was no warmth there, only a faint recognition of something he had seen before. "You see," Mrs. Hope continued, "this is not just about a mistake in method. This is about integrity. A student like Amara doesn't just get to solve problems outside the scope of the curriculum. It's disruptive. It's a violation of the academic rules." Amara could feel the tension rising in the room. She could feel the weight of the accusation pulling her down, tightening around her chest like a noose. She had seen it before, in the eyes of teachers, in the whispers of her classmates. The belief that she didn't belong here, that someone like her, from a neighborhood like hers, could never be capable of doing what she had done. "Are you saying," Amara finally spoke, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched tight in her lap, "that I'm not allowed to think outside the lines? That I'm not allowed to solve a problem the way I should have solved it?" The principal glanced between the two women, his lips pressed tight. He didn't speak. Mrs. Hope stepped forward, her gaze narrowing. "It's not just about the solution, Amara. It's about the fact that you didn't follow the guidelines. You didn't follow my method." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And we both know what happens when students like you break the rules, don't we?" Amara's heart thudded in her chest. She didn't need to ask what Mrs. Hope meant. She had heard it 100 times, from 100 different mouths. Students like you. The phrase always came with a weight, with assumptions, with invisible chains that tried to bind her to a place she had never belonged. She didn't back down. "I solved the problem, and I followed the rules of logic. I didn't break any rule. If the method you taught doesn't work for me, that's not my fault." The principal finally cleared his throat. He looked at Amara, his voice thin and uninterested. "Miss Lewis, this is a serious accusation. Cheating is a violation of the school's policy. If it's proven that you deliberately manipulated the test or misrepresented your work, there will be consequences." The words hit her like a slap. She had expected them. She knew what was coming. But still, hearing them, hearing the principal say it out loud, made it feel all the more real. The noose was tightening. They were coming for her. They were going to find a way to make this her fault. Mrs. Hope was quick to back him up, her words like poison dripping from her lips. "She's a troublemaker," she said, her voice laced with disdain. "This isn't the first time she's caused problems. She's been a disruptive force in my classroom from the start. If we let this go, what message does it send? That students can just bypass the system?" The principal nodded, as if he had already made up his mind. "We need to look at all of this carefully, Amara. Cheating in any form is grounds for expulsion. You understand that, don't you?" Amara looked at the two of them, the teacher who saw her as a threat, and the principal who had already decided she didn't belong. In their eyes, she was already guilty, but she wouldn't let them break her. She refused to let them win. "I didn't cheat," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "I solved the problem in the way I saw fit. The problem isn't with me, it's with your system that refuses to see anything beyond what's in the textbook." There was a moment of silence. The principal's gaze never wavered, but Mrs. Hope's eyes glinted with something darker. Anger, fear, Maybe both. Then I guess we'll have to let the board decide what happens next, the principal said finally. And with that, Amara was left with the knowledge that the battle had only just begun. They wanted to break her, to bend her to their will, to remind her that people like her didn't rise above. But she was ready. And whatever came next, she would fight. Because the truth was, they couldn't stop her. The principal's office had never felt so much like a courtroom. Amara sat in a chair across from Mr. Harris, the principal, his cold, disinterested eyes scanning the papers in front of him. Every now and then, he would glance up at her, his gaze piercing, like he was trying to read her, to figure her out, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It was a game, this, a game they were playing, and Amara wasn't sure if she was meant to win. She had no lawyer, no defense but her own words. And in this room, words could be weapons. And she had learned long ago that when you were black and from a poor neighborhood, your words didn't carry the same weight as others. Mrs. Hope was there too, standing by the side, watching with a stern expression, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She had a smug, self-righteous air about her, as though she was the one holding all the cards. Every now and then, she would shoot a glance at Amara, as if daring her to say something that might ruin everything. So, Miss Lewis, Mr. Harris began, his voice as dull as a hammer against metal. We have a problem. You've been accused of cheating during your exam, and I'm sure you realize that's a serious offense. It could lead to your suspension or even expulsion. Amara stayed silent for a moment, meeting his gaze. She could feel the weight of his words sinking in, but there was no fear in her. Fear had no place here. If anything, she felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about the exam anymore. This was about something far bigger, something they weren't prepared for. Mrs. Hope chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. She's a troublemaker, Mr. Harris. This is just the latest in a long line of disruptive behavior. She's always challenging authority, always refusing to follow the rules. I've been trying to get her to conform to the system, but it's clear she has no respect for it. Miss Hope, we'll handle this. Mr. Harris cut her off, his tone sharper than before, as if he was used to getting his way. Now, Miss Lewis, he turned back to Amara. Tell me, how did you come up with that solution on your test? It's nothing like the method we taught in class. The only explanation I can think of is that you cheated. Amara could feel Mrs. Hope's eyes on her like burning coals. The accusation of cheating hung in the air, but she refused to let it weigh her down. I didn't cheat, she said firmly, her voice steady. I solved the problem the way it made sense to me. The method you taught doesn't work for everyone. Just because it's not the way you expect it, doesn't mean it's wrong. Mr. Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his desk. You're a smart girl, Miss Lewis. I won't deny that. But there's something about your approach that doesn't sit right with me. People like you don't do this well in school. It's not in your background. You're supposed to follow the rules. The system is made for people who conform, not for those who try to bend it. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her composure. His words were like a slap, but they didn't reach her. She had heard them before, so many times in her life. People like you. Not your kind. You don't belong here. Her mind flashed to her mother, who had spent her entire life fighting to make sure she didn't feel inferior. Her mother had always told her that the world would try to make her feel small, but Amara couldn't let them win. Not here. Not now. The door opened suddenly, and Amara's mother walked in. She was tired, the exhaustion written across her face, but there was a quiet strength in her step. Her eyes, usually soft with concern, were hard today, and Amara knew that something had snapped inside her mother. They had crossed a line. This wasn't just about Amara anymore. This was about the fight they had been having their whole lives. A fight for respect, for space, for equality. Her mother's voice was low, but it filled the room with the power of someone who had been silenced for far too long. What is this about, Mr. Harris? I've heard that my daughter has been accused of cheating, accused of not following your system. Is that why she's sitting here? Her eyes flicked to Mrs. Hope. Because she's too smart for your little rules. Because she doesn't fit the mold you've made for her? Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the papers again, almost as though he was trying to hide from the truth that was standing right in front of him. Mrs. Hope spoke up again, her voice dripping with disdain. Your daughter is a problem, Mrs. Lewis, a disruptive influence in the classroom. She doesn't follow the curriculum, she doesn't follow the system, and she certainly doesn't respect authority. I've been trying to get through to her, but she's stubborn. She thinks she's better than everyone else. Amara's mother's face hardened, but her voice remained calm, like a blade wrapped in velvet. No, Mrs. Hope. She doesn't think she's better than anyone else. She's just trying to get by in a world that's already told her she doesn't belong. You want her to follow your rules, but those rules were never made for her, or anyone like her. The words cut through the tension like a knife. It was the truth that had been avoided for so long. The truth about the systems that were designed to fail people like Amara and her mother. It was never about intelligence, never about ability. It was about conformity, about keeping people in their place. Mr. Harris, clearly uncomfortable, shifted again in his seat. Mrs. Lewis, I understand your frustration, but that's not the issue here. The issue is whether Amara followed the proper procedure in her test. The solution she provided, well, it's just too advanced, too far outside the scope of what's allowed. Too advanced, Mrs. Lewis echoed, her voice tight. Or too different. You're afraid of what she's capable of, Mr. Harris. You're afraid because you see her potential and you don't know how to handle it, so you turn her into a problem. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For the first time in that room, Amara felt a spark of hope. Her mother wasn't backing down, and neither would she. Amara, her mother said softly, but her words were meant for everyone, has never been the problem. The problem is the system that's been built to keep people like us out. The problem is the fact that she's being punished for thinking outside the box, for doing something you don't know how to teach, because your methods were never meant for her to succeed in the first place. Amara looked at her mother, the fire in her eyes burning brighter. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in this fight. It wasn't just about a test anymore. It was about everything they had been through. The quiet, constant struggle against a system that had never been designed to support them. This was their battle now, a battle for respect, for recognition, for the right to be themselves. Mr. Harris didn't say anything. He looked at Mrs. Lewis, then at Amara, and back at the papers. There was no clear resolution, no definitive outcome, but in the silence that followed, something shifted in the room, something that made it clear. They hadn't broken her. Not yet. Amara stood up slowly, her back straight, her eyes never leaving the principal's face. If you're going to expel me, then do it. But know this, I'll be back. You can't silence me. Not now, not ever. And with that, she turned and walked out of the office, her mother right behind her. The door slammed shut, but outside, in the hallway, Amara knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, like the air before a storm. Amara sat at the table, facing the committee, her mother by her side. The room was stark, too clean, too bright. The kind of room where people go to decide the fate of others, to pass judgment. The committee members, all white and well-dressed, sat across from her with their clipboards, their pens poised, ready to write down anything that would validate the judgment they had already made. She could feel their eyes on her, the quiet skepticism, the judgment in their stares, the unspoken assumption that someone like her, someone from a background like hers, couldn't possibly be capable of what they were about to witness. The air in the room was cold, but Amara felt nothing but calm. She had prepared for this. She had been waiting for it. All the whispers, all the criticisms, all the ways they tried to put her in her place. Today, she would show them exactly who she was. The head of the committee, Dr. Carlson, a balding man in his late 50s, cleared his throat and spoke first, his voice stern, though there was a hint of uncertainty in it. "Miss Lewis," he began, his gaze fixed on her. "As you know, we are here today to review the circumstances surrounding your recent examination. You were accused of cheating, and it's our duty to ensure that such actions are not tolerated in this school. However," he continued, "if you are truly capable of solving problems beyond what you've been taught, we would like to see your potential. We want to understand how you arrived at your solution." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't say a word. She simply nodded, acknowledging his statement. She had already proven herself in their eyes. She didn't need to explain her intelligence. The solution was there, all along, waiting to be acknowledged. Dr. Carlson gestured to the chalkboard behind him. "We have a problem here, a more complex one this time. If you can solve this one, and solve it without any tricks, without straying from what we expect, we may be able to reconsider your case." The room was still. The committee members looked at each other, some with nervous glances, others with faint smirks, thinking this would be the moment that would expose her. They had already decided she didn't belong. They couldn't fathom the idea that someone like Amara, someone from the wrong side of town, could outperform them, outsmart them. Amara stood up slowly, her posture straight and confident. She didn't speak. She simply walked to the board and picked up the chalk. There was a hushed silence as the committee leaned forward, watching her every move. The problem on the board was a complex series of equations, beyond anything that was part of the curriculum. The numbers and variables twisted into a knot of abstract concepts, designed to trap someone who only knew how to follow instructions, to stay within the narrow confines of what was expected. But Amara didn't see a trap. She saw a challenge, and it was a challenge she had been ready for all her life. She started writing, her hand moving fluidly, each stroke of the chalk deliberate, calm, and precise. Word for word, number for number, she began to unravel the problem, the equations falling into place one by one. Her mind worked like a machine, quick and efficient, as if the problem had already been solved in her head before she even touched the chalk. The committee was silent. They watched her in disbelief, unable to understand how she was managing to break down such a complex problem so easily. Their eyes darted from the board to each other, their skepticism growing with every line she wrote. The numbers were moving, coming together in a way they hadn't expected, in a way they couldn't predict. Minutes passed, and the atmosphere in the room became heavier. Dr. Carlson's face had gone from stoic to perplexed, his eyes narrowing as he tried to keep up with her solution. One of the committee members, a younger woman named Mrs. Walker, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had expected Amara to falter, to show her incompetence, but instead, the young girl seemed to be rewriting the problem entirely, as if she had the answers long before the committee had even realized the question. Amara was so focused, so calm, that it almost seemed like she was in a different world. She didn't look at the committee. She didn't care about their stares. All that mattered was the task at hand, the answer, the truth that they had been so desperate to deny. Finally, she stepped back from the board, her hand still steady as she placed the chalk down. The problem was solved. Every equation, every variable had fallen into place. For a moment, no one moved. The committee members stared at the board, their eyes wide with disbelief. The silence in the room was deafening, so heavy that it felt suffocating. They had expected her to fail. They had expected her to fall short, but instead, she had done something they could not explain. Dr. Carlson was the first to speak, though his voice was shaky. I don't understand. This isn't possible. How did you do that?" His eyes flicked to his colleagues, his voice faltering as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Amara turned to face them, her expression neutral. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She simply looked at them, eyes steady, with the kind of calmness that came from knowing she had done what they thought was impossible. She had done it her way. "I solved it," she said quietly but firmly. "The way it should have been solved." For a moment, there was no response. The committee was stunned, their minds struggling to process the fact that this girl, this black girl from a poor neighborhood, had done something they couldn't even begin to explain. It was as if the foundation beneath them had shifted, and they were now standing on unstable ground. Mrs. Hope's face had gone pale. She had expected Amara to fail. She had hoped for it. But now, standing in the same room as the young girl who had shattered her preconceived notions, she was lost for words. The bitterness she had held toward Amara, the frustration that had bubbled beneath the surface, now seemed pointless. Amara didn't need to say anything else. She didn't need to argue or defend herself. She had shown them the truth, not just in numbers, but in every quiet, unspoken moment. She had proven that she was more than they could ever understand. Dr. Carlson finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." Mrs. Walker cleared her throat. Maybe it's time we reconsider how we measure intelligence." Amara nodded once, a small but decisive movement. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. She had already proved who she was. And as she walked out of the room, her head held high. The whispers behind her were no longer about her failure. This time, they would be about her brilliance. It should have been a victory. The room had been buzzing with disbelief after Amara had solved the impossible problem, the one that no one thought could be solved by someone like her. The committee, the teachers, even the principal, had been forced to confront the undeniable truth of her brilliance. She had done what they had thought was impossible. She had proven them wrong. But as Amara walked out of that room, her head held high, her heart pounding with a sense of triumph. She didn't feel the rush of victory. She didn't feel the thrill of a well-earned triumph. Instead, she felt the weight of something heavier, something that no one had prepared her for. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Her mother had been with her every step of the way, standing beside her in that room, offering nothing but quiet strength. But even now, as they walked down the long hallway of the school, there was no celebration in the air. No congratulations, no applause. The school had been forced to acknowledge Amara's genius, but they weren't ready to accept it. The real battle was just beginning, and Amara knew it. The next day, she sat in the same classroom, the same seat she had always occupied. The walls, which had once felt like barriers, now seemed like mocking witnesses. Her classmates were different. Some of them, the ones who had doubted her, the ones who had whispered about her, had fallen silent. They knew the truth now, but there was no respect, no acknowledgement of her victory. Instead, she sat there, invisible. Mrs. Hope stood at the front of the classroom, her back straight and her expression cold. She didn't look at Amara as she entered, didn't give her any hint of recognition. Instead, the teacher resumed her lesson as if nothing had happened, as if the fact that Amara had rewritten the rules, had solved what they thought was impossible, hadn't even mattered. Amara could feel her gaze burning into the back of her head. The hatred, the disdain, it was still there. Nothing had changed. "Class," Mrs. Hope said, her voice devoid of warmth. "Today, we are going to review the same problems we've been working on for weeks. The solutions, as always, must be solved using the methods we've taught you." Her eyes flicked toward Amara briefly, but it was a look of contempt, a silent reminder that she was not supposed to be here, not in this space, not at this level. Amara didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had already shown them who she was. She had already proven the point they hadn't wanted to believe. But as the class went on, the whispers started again. Her classmates, the same ones who had once laughed at her, who had called her names behind her back, were now talking, but this time their words were sharp. They weren't asking about how she had done it, how she had solved the problem they couldn't. They were talking about her place in this school. "She only got that right because she's lucky," one of them whispered. "Probably cheated," another added. Amara felt the sting of those words like hot needles. Her classmates had seen her win. They had seen her brilliance on display. But to them, it didn't matter. She would never be more than the exception. Just a momentary anomaly that didn't fit into their neatly defined world. They were ready to dismiss it, ready to believe that nothing had really changed. She felt small again, not because of her own doubt, but because of the system, because of the school, because of the walls that refused to acknowledge her genius. Mrs. Hope's eyes lingered on her for just a moment longer. Amara could feel the teacher's gaze like a heavy weight on her shoulders. But there was no sense of respect in it, no sense of pride for her student's achievement. Just a quiet, seething anger, an anger that came from being outdone by someone she had already written off. Later that afternoon, Amara was called into the principal's office. Her heart sank as she entered the room, the same room where her fate had been decided just days before. She had solved the problem. She had proven herself. She had been right. But now, the reality of it all was coming to light. And the truth, it seemed, hadn't been enough. "Miss Lewis," Mr. Harris began, his voice no longer filled with the unease it had carried the other day, but now calm, almost dismissive. "We've decided to allow you to stay at Jefferson High. However, this comes with conditions." Amara's heart skipped a beat. She had expected something else, something different, something that would recognize the victory she had fought for. "What conditions?" she asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. "The fact that you solved the problem," Mr. Harris said, "has been noted. However, we believe your approach was unconventional. Moving forward, you will need to adhere strictly to the curriculum. We cannot allow students to disregard the methods that have been proven to work." It felt like a punch in the gut. She had proven herself, but in their eyes, it was still not enough. Her genius, her brilliance, had been ignored. She wasn't being celebrated for showing them the way forward. Instead, she was being silenced, pushed back into the box they had created for her. "You're lucky we've decided to keep you," Mrs. Hope added coldly, standing by the door, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed firmly on Amara. "You should be grateful we're letting you stay. You don't fit the mold, and you're a disruption. But for now, you're allowed to remain." There were no words of praise, no congratulations, no applause, no recognition of the battle Amara had fought, the intelligence she had displayed, the system she had defied. It was as if nothing had changed at all. Her victory had been hollowed out, stripped of its meaning. She was still just a problem in their eyes, something they couldn't quite fit into their narrow, predetermined definitions of what success looked like. Her genius had been silenced. Her triumph had been reduced to a footnote. Amara stood there, her hands clenched at her sides. It wasn't enough. The recognition wasn't enough. She had fought so hard, and yet all they had given her was permission to stay. Nothing more. As she walked out of the office, her head still held high, she realized the truth. They would never truly see her. They would never truly accept her. Her brilliance would always be a threat to them, a challenge to the way they saw the world. But she didn't need their approval. Not anymore. She knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over. She would keep proving herself again and again until they had no choice but to see her. But for now, she would walk through their halls, invisible to them all, still fighting, still undefeated. 10 years had passed, 10 years in which Amara had built her life, step by step, brick by brick. She had become a successful scientist, a woman whose name began to resonate in academic circles, whose research was changing the game in her field. The young girl who had been ignored, despised, and marginalized in her own school was now a respected voice in science. A voice that was breaking down barriers in a system that still struggled to accept true diversity. But something inside her had never stopped burning. Something that didn't go out with the years, or the success, or the recognition. Because deep down, she knew that what had happened in those days at Jefferson High wasn't just a simple memory. It wasn't something she could leave behind. That system, so rigid, so cruel, was still there, rooted in the walls of that school. The injustice, the racism, the indifference she had faced were still lingering, marking new generations. And Amara knew she would have to face that monster again. The email she received weeks before was the spark that reignited the flame. a case of racial discrimination within the same school where she had fought to survive. An anonymous report, a pattern of systemic abuse. The names and dates left no doubt. The same school that had tried to crush her, to silence her brilliance, was once again breeding grounds for racism, exclusion, and disregard for students who didn't fit into its mold. So she returned. Not as a student who wanted to be accepted, but as a researcher, a scientist who, now, didn't need anyone's permission. A woman who could walk into those ruins and finally claim what was hers. Justice. As she walked toward the building, memories assaulted her. The same entrance, the same door, the same walls that once seemed to want to crush her. But now, instead of feeling small, Amara felt large. She had overcome it all. She had left behind those voices that once told her she couldn't, that she didn't belong. She walked into the building with a firm step. In the halls, she didn't see the kids who had once looked at her with disdain. She didn't see the same indifferent faces of the teachers. Instead, there were new faces, young ones full of hope, dreams to be built. But Amara knew the shadow of what had happened still loomed over them, and this time, she wouldn't stay silent. The new principal, a much younger man than the last one, greeted her in his office. At first, he seemed taken aback seeing the woman standing before him, so different from the student she had once been. "Dr. Lewis, it's an honor to have you here," he said, somewhat hesitantly, as he stood to shake her hand. "I know your work has been praised in the scientific community. How may I assist you?" "I'm here for something more important than my work," Amara replied, her voice cold and calculated. "I'm here to conduct an investigation." The principal frowned. "An investigation? About what exactly?" "About systemic racism in this school," Amara replied without hesitation. "About how your system continues to exclude students who don't fit into its mold." The principal tried to hide his discomfort with a nervous smile. "I think you're mistaken, Dr. Lewis. This is an inclusive place. We accept everyone here." Amara stared at him, saying nothing. The words from 10 years ago echoed in her mind. "You don't belong here. You can't do this." "I'm not mistaken," she finally said, her voice as cold as ice. "You'll see soon enough." The investigations began. Amara gathered evidence, interviewed students and teachers, collected documents that clearly showed the patterns of discrimination. The story of her own suffering, the way she had been stripped of her voice, her humanity, was repeated over and over again in the testimonies of current students. The same methods of exclusion, the same invisible barriers that had been raised to keep students of color from true opportunity. The school board couldn't ignore it for long. Finally, after weeks of investigation, a meeting was called to discuss the report. Amara was there, watching, her mother by her side, who hadn't left her side for a moment since she had decided to take this step. The woman who had fought so her daughter wouldn't be seen as less than others. The woman who had taught her to never back down, never be silent, never be silenced. Finally, the moment came to face the teacher who had been the central figure of her suffering all those years ago. Mrs. Hope was there, though visibly different, older, but with the same arrogance in her posture. The police, who had been called to the scene after the gathered evidence, walked into the room at that precise moment. Their footsteps were like a death sentence. Mrs. Hope looked up, bewildered, as the officers approached her, placing her hands in cuffs. "You are under arrest for systemic racial discrimination, abuse of power, and mistreatment of students," one of the officers said, as the woman could only look around, speechless, as if the world was crumbling around her. The room went silent. The principal and other members of the school board seemed hesitant, uncomfortable, as everything around them fell apart. The case was clear, the evidence irrefutable. The faces in the room were tense, some ashamed, others with palpable fear that their own roles in the racist system might soon be exposed. Amara watched all of this from her place, but she felt no emotion. There was no joy in seeing the woman who had belittled her for so long being taken away in handcuffs. There was no satisfaction in her heart, knowing that justice was finally being served. The truth had come to light. but it didn't matter anymore. The justice was late, and what truly mattered had already happened. Amara had achieved what many had thought impossible. She had done it. And though Mrs. Hope was arrested and taken away, Amara realized that through the years, she had gained so much more than just a recognition. She had gained her freedom, and the rest, even justice, no longer mattered. She knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over. She would keep proving herself again and again until they had no choice but to see her. But for now, she would walk through their halls, invisible to them all, still fighting, still undefeated.